Hello everyone and welcome to the flipped collab for A2, the multimodal report. I have also made a flipped collab for A2 presentation, so you can either watch both and then make a decision about which one you'd like to choose, but you can find both of them in the A2 Padlet, so the A2 presentation as well. This is the multimodal report. Essentially, the two assignments are quite similar in the fact that we're both looking at assessment, we're both looking at NAPLAN. Pretty much the way we present is going to be different because the multimodal report encompasses more of the idea of having text with perhaps images or video or things to support the text, whereas the presentation is a timed 9-minute presentation where you're presenting as if you were presenting to parents. So essentially very similar content, just I guess it depends on how you want to present your A2. Might change your mind on which one you decide on. I'm not going to read out all of the assessment details, but I thought I'd pop them in just so that they could be part of our slideshow. Essentially, this is worth 40%. It is due on Monday, the 30th of September, which is the Monday of week 9. And this one is 1,600 words, give or take 10%. And the essence of what we're trying to achieve with this multimodal report is to make connections to NAPLAN and to other forms of assessment and reporting in English. We're going to critically compare them, which is very similar to A2 presentation. And we're going to use some content descriptors and some content from the Australian curriculum to help support us with our decisions. Now, as I've said all along in these flip collabs, I've tried to choose Rachel's top 5 things to get you started. And I know that this being a 40% weighted assessment, I can't possibly answer everything in this half an hour, so please think of it more as a way of things maybe you can think of to start with, things that you can go off and start researching, start looking into so that you can make a start or even just formulate questions so that in week 9 when we have our interactive collabs you've got something to go off and something to base your questions on. So let's have a look at Rachel's top 5 things. So our number 1 thing is to start off with the explanation of NAPLAN and your chosen assessments. So if you have a look at the assessment details, point number 1 says to briefly explain NAPLAN and 2 other forms of assessment and reporting in English. Now, NAPLAN has been chosen for us, and that is the same with presentation as well, that we will all be focusing on NAPLAN. Obviously, the literacy components of that NAPLAN, not the other elements. So let's have a look at NAPLAN first. We're going to give a brief overview and you might be wondering what exactly that means. So when you go off and do your researching and get a little bit more acquainted with NAPLAN, as I said, we're going to focus on the literacy elements. So we know that maths and numeracy is also tested, but we're just focusing on the reading, writing, spelling and grammar, probably most predominantly the reading and writing. We're going to be focusing on what is the purpose of the test, what kind of literacy data is collected, who is the test administered by perhaps, these types of questions. So you don't need to follow the questions that I've written here exactly. They're just things that I would imagine could possibly go in a brief explanation of what NAPLAN is. So you're telling us, what is the purpose of this test? What kind of data are we going to get out of it? What do teachers get out of it, perhaps? Maybe you can make a little link to perhaps what schools and governments get out of it. But remember, this is not your critical analysis yet, so don't start analysing things and giving us opinions about things just yet. Just focus on the fact that it's a brief explanation of what the test is. And you don't need to go into any more detail than that. So go off and do some researching about NAPLAN just to find out what it is, who's it administered by, what was the purpose of it perhaps, and that's your starting point. Now, we all have strong opinions about NAPLAN, particularly if we're parents of primary school and high school age students ourselves. Just remember to focus on the data and focus on the points of NAPLAN rather than how perhaps it made our kids feel on the day and anxiety and whatnot. But we'll touch on that a little bit further as well through the presentation. Now, your other choice of assessment is completely up to you as long as you've got something within that year 4, 5 and 6 range. So you want to be choosing an assessment that's appropriate to the age levels that we are looking at. So if you're going to suggest to me that a running record that is a decoding test is an appropriate test for a year 5, 6 student, then there might be an issue with your assessment. So try to remember that it is the upper school that we are focusing on. Now you need to be specific about what kind of focus the test has. So if it's a reading test, just telling us that it's a reading test is probably quite general. I think you can be a little bit more specific about what elements of reading the test is actually testing. Lots of people have great ideas in these assignments, but they just don't take it sometimes to the next step where they just be really explicit about exactly the types of skills that particular test is assessing. And the more explicit you can be and the more you can hone in on what the focus is, it's probably going to be a clearer explanation and definitely a clearer and more explicit critical analysis. Perhaps you can talk to us about how the test is administered. So is it a conference? Do we talk to each other? Is it a written test? Do we have to sit down? What's the format of the test? Perhaps it's a multiple choice. Perhaps it's a worded answer thing. And what kind of data? We're always going to bring it back to the data, because essentially when we think about assessment, that's the whole nature of assessment, isn't it? So we want to focus on the fact that this assessment has to give us data that drives our teaching and planning. So when we sit down and we want to write lessons and we want to formulate goals for students, we need to know exactly where they are and how we're going to get them to the next place where they need to be. Now, I didn't mention this in my A2 presentation collab that I made just before this one, but it actually dawned on me as I was writing up these slides that perhaps the assessment choice is completely up to you. So whether you want to choose a writing thing, a reading thing, NAPLAN is our core one, but the other assessment choices are up to you. And then it just dawned on me that perhaps in an effort to compare apples with apples, if you like, it might be ideal. I'm just thinking in my mind that I would choose 2 reading. I did suggest in the presentation that you can just choose whatever you like, but now that I'm having a think about it, it might be better that if you are going to do a critical analysis, that you're comparing 2 reading assessments, because then you're comparing like with like rather than trying to compare a reading and a writing. I'm not saying it's impossible, and you can certainly choose whatever you like, and I'm sure that you can make it work, but it's just food for thought that you might want to choose 2 things that are similar in nature so that you've got points to compare. But as I said, just an idea I'm throwing out there. So we've started off with a brief explanation of NAPLAN and just what our 2 assessments are. Now, I know everybody's going to be screaming out, how do we format this? How do we structure this? And there's no real right way. You might want to follow NAPLAN the whole way through and keep talking about NAPLAN and then briefly discuss your other 2 assessments, and it's all become a bit of a separate entity. I know when I had a look through lots of assessments from last time, there wasn't any particular way or structure, or I think every student sort of just took it on themselves to think of a way that made it work for them. Because you do have to compare, it kind of does make it hard to talk about all of them separately, I suppose, because you need to have that element of comparison. But certainly the format and the layout can be something that you guys can chat a little bit further about in the interactive collab. So just going with the brief outline first, and then we will move on, if I can get my slide to change, to compare and evaluate NAPLAN and your 2 other assessments. Now, lots of people quite liked tables last time, so feel free to put it in a table if you feel that that's a way of getting some of your ideas down. You might have a table to start with, and then you might have a paragraph of explanation, further explaining underneath. Again, these are things that can be chatted about in the interactive collab in a little bit more detail, and perhaps we can brainstorm ideas on the best way to set this out, as there is no one particular right way. So I just decided that I would choose Probe and a read and retell just for the purpose of this presentation and these slides, just to have something to talk about. So if you're not aware of those two, they're both reading assessments, which has sort of got my train of thought into reading. As I said before, I wanted to compare like with like. You don't have to. So I've broken it down into the validity of the data to inform my teaching. So I want to know, does this assessment give me really good quality data that I can then take and work with and make some groupings or write some learning goals for somebody? You know, is it actually informing, is it giving me the information I need about what kids know and what they can do? Now, Probe and Read and Retell are both comprehension based, but they do give you different data at the end. So a Probe basically is a test where I used to do mine verbally with the kids. I know that some teachers do it written so that it doesn't take up as much time. It's basically a test where they read a little passage of writing, and then each different set of comprehension questions tests a different comprehension skill. So I really liked this test because I found that I could sit down and say, oh, wow, little Johnny over here got, his literal comprehensions questions correct. He got his reorganization questions correct, but he's really struggling with vocab. That's going to be an issue for him. And I can see from my results for the grade that Billy and William are struggling with those things as well. So I'm going to make a group of those three and focus on vocab with them for the next week. Or I might find that student A and D and E haven't been or need to focus on inference. So Probe is quite specific in telling you what comprehension skills are lacking. It also gives you a chronological age that it believes that students should be working at. So you're obviously hoping that the students' actual age and reading age match up, so you can see who's above and below. That compared to my retell, I'm not a big fan of read and retell. I find that it doesn't give me much information at all, besides the fact that the students can rattle off the basic idea of the story they've just read. Obviously that's being a little bit scathing. You can find positives of read and retell, especially if you just want to do a quick overview of what they understood of the story. I know that some of the downsides of read and retell is that some kids actually comprehend more than they let on in just a basic retell, especially if they're not the type that are very articulate. In a verbal retell, they won't tell you all of the details, not because they didn't understand the story, but more that they just can't be bothered or don't know the significance of having to retell all the story in all the different bits. They probably get the correct sequence right, but there might be other elements of the story that they did actually understand and just not going to tell you in a basic retell. Retell is quite a basic skill. And when I had a look at the curriculum, retell pops up more in the early years. So perhaps it's not testing the higher order skills. To do a retell, all you're doing is sequencing events and talking about, the beginning, middle, and end of a story. You don't have to actually do much more in terms of analyze vocab or infer clues from a text. So I find that the data, the quality of the data that would come out of that one wouldn't be as good as the quality of the data that I'm getting from Probe. Now, the quality of the data that comes from NAPLAN is that in that one test in that point of time in early May, when kids sit down and do NAPLAN, we get an accurate result for that particular day. It's under exam conditions, so you could argue how well or whether it's accurate, that particular snapshot. My biggest problem in terms of data informing is that it's useless for teachers. So my kids, because I predominantly had grade 5s and 6s, my grade 5s would sit NAPLAN in May, and as a teacher we generally wouldn't get the results until say August or September, which means completely useless. You can't use the data from NAPLAN to inform your teaching at all because it's too old by the time it gets to you. So we don't use it to inform learning goals, we don't use it to inform our planning, which is a bummer because that's what teachers need assessment for. So I suppose when you're having a look at NAPLAN and you're focusing on what some of the benefits are, I think you need to look broader than just the classroom. You have to try and remove yourself, if you're a parent, from being scathing about the fact that kids get anxiety about it. Try and step back from that and look at the bigger picture of how it can inform on a wider range. Now, you might have noticed that in the assessment details, it talks about reporting just as much as it talks about assessment. So with each of our assessments, we should be able to make some connections to how it reports to people. I suppose it makes sense for us to think about how it reports to parents, but as I said in the A2 presentation, we need to think really broadly about what we mean about reporting. We can report to parents, we can also report to colleagues, we can report to leadership in our school, we can report to community, we can report to government, we can report to all sorts of external stakeholders as well. So when you're thinking about reporting, try and think a little bit more broadly than just reporting to parents. Now with NAPLAN, we do need to connect to the fact that it does report to parents. Mind you, the data is old, but they do get quite an extensive booklet with all of the data and graphs and whatnot for parents to have a look at. Compared to statewide means and so forth. So parents get this quite extensive pack. But in terms of reporting, NAPLAN's biggest advantage is actually bigger than the classroom. So as teachers, we've sat on dozens of NAPLAN meetings over the years, talking about things to do with school-wide data. Firstly, schools will look for value added. So if you are a child in grade 3 in 2017, then you're going to have NAPLAN data from that year, and then we should be able to compare it to the NAPLAN data of 2019 grade 5. Every student should progress the 2 years of learning in that time, so we could highlight perhaps students that were potentially at risk, or does the NAPLAN data match up with what we know about that student and our own assessment and reporting. So you can use it to track kids over time. Schools also use it to inform school-wide policies like strategic plans. So if you know anybody who works in a school, or if you've got a mentor teacher that perhaps you've worked with and you're working with now or still keep contact with, you can talk to them or ask your ELA about how schools use the data. So for example, at the school where my kids go, NAPLAN data showed that writing was the weakest of the NAPLAN data. It was a bit of a trend for the past few years that of all of the literacy-based skills that NAPLAN assesses, that writing was the weakest. So then they made writing a focus. It became written into their strategic plan that over the next few years they would focus on writing and start implementing programs and getting teachers PD, and they ended up getting that 7 Steps to Writing course in. So it does inform the school on where they need to improve, and they use that data. Governments use the data as well to inform policy. I know NAPLAN's always all over the news telling us about how bad a job we're doing. So it's got that wider implications as well. Now you're probably thinking, well, NAPLAN's easy to talk about in terms of reporting, but how am I going to talk about things that just teachers use in their classrooms? So I've given an example here. So Probe is just a classroom-based assessment. I probably wouldn't share it with parents. Some assessments like a portfolio, or what other one can I think of? Something like a portfolio could be shared with parents because you can talk about it in like a student-led conference or a parent-teacher interview. So a portfolio is an example of an assessment that you could share with parents. My probe testing I wouldn't share. It would just be something that I would want to use for my own data, but Remember I said to think broadly about what reporting means? And my probe data could come along with me to a PLT or my grade year level meeting, and we could talk about oftentimes teachers bring samples, we bring writing moderation samples, and we all sit down together and we talk about different kids because we're all responsible for the kids in that cohort. So we sit down together and we talk about planning, and we talk about learning goals for a particular kid, and we talk about, what does a 2.5 a piece of writing look like for you, and I'm going to compare it to mine, and we're going to moderate. So there's times when teams get together and they share assessments. So think about a time when, think about the 2 assessments that you're going to choose, and think about what elements of reporting you could connect to, whether it's parents, whether it's fellow teachers, whether it's leadership, whether it's school policy making, whether it's government. Think about what element of reporting you could talk about. So you're probably wondering how we're going to compare all these things. Like I said, tables work well, followed by perhaps some follow-up discussion about what are the benefits and overall. If I was going to compare probe and read and retell, I would talk about the fact that I like probe better. Obviously not in first person, you'll use all your terrific academic language, but I talk about the fact that probe just gives me so much more information than just whether a child can sequence events in the story, and that I like the fact that I can find out which particular comprehension strategy is lacking, so that's where it informs my teaching. It's such a big area to cover, especially in the time that I've got here, so please come to the Interactive Collab or listen back to the Interactive Collab so that you can listen back to the brainstorming and get more ideas about what you want to do in that section. A couple of little things to remember. You can choose any assessment you like. I did say that already. Middle to upper, which was grade 4, 5 and 6. You can choose 2 that are either reading or writing, and it might be beneficial to compare apples with apples, which I've also already remembered. And remember to focus on the quality of the data and not external factors. I did say this in the A2 presentation as well. When you're comparing and you're critically evaluating assessment, you always focus on the quality of the data that comes back to you. So I was saying in the A2 presentation, a limitation of probe is that you have to photocopy sheets. Now, that surely is a limitation because the poor trees suffer, but it's not a limitation in terms of the quality of the data that comes back. Try to focus on the data and not other things. So don't tell me things like it takes too long, or don't tell me things like I have to photocopy it, or don't tell me things like it gets too noisy while the teacher's doing the test. They're all external things that, yes, certainly bug us in the classroom, and we don't like the classroom being noisy during a test, or if the teacher is one-on-one testing and all the other students are just doing something else, that's not a fault of the test as in the quality of the data that comes back. It is certainly a management issue and teachers have to work through that, but it's not a criticism of the quality of the assessment itself. So try not to focus on the noise in the classroom or the parents not being able to access it or it being too expensive. Sometimes people like to say, oh, I don't like Probe because to order all the folders costs the school too much money, or it uses too much internet, or we don't have enough computers for that online assessment. But they're all external things that happen in a school anyway. It's not the test's fault that the school doesn't have enough computers. So we're talking about the quality of the data, not other things. All right, we need to use curriculum, and I'm going to grab the assessment details because I'm going to let you know exactly what it says. It says we need to identify 3 content descriptors within the upper primary years 4, 5 and 6, the Australian Curriculum English, to support your critical evaluation. 1 content descriptor for each form of assessment in literacy. So you'll have 1 content descriptor that is supporting your critical evaluation about NAPLAN. You'll have 1 content descriptor that's going to be supporting your critical evaluation of assessment choice number 1, and you're going to have another content descriptor that's going to support your second choice. So in my little example, I had NAPLAN and then I had Probe and then I had Read and Retell. So I could find content descriptors that support my use of that assessment, because at the end of the day, we are assessing the content descriptors that we need to be teaching. So the assessment needs to match what is in the curriculum. Otherwise, why on earth are we testing for it? Remember, the curriculum is the what of what we need to teach. So probe, why am I doing that with my class? Why am I taking the time to implement this particular strategy? Why is it my choice of lots and lots of assessments that I could choose from? Well, I know that probe is a test of comprehension skills, and I know that it tests for literal, inferential, reorganization, vocab, evaluation, and reaction. They're the skills that probe tests. Then I go to the curriculum and I say, oh, here we go, comprehension strategies. This is the reason why I use probe in my classroom, is because I have to teach comprehension strategies, and I need to know that the kids can use a variety of comprehension strategies. That's something that they need to know from foundation, probably all the way up to year 10. But just to focus on these, I've accidentally cut off year 6, which is very silly of me, but you can imagine there's another one here. So we're talking about this, the fact that it uses inferred and literal comprehension, even as low down as grade 1. We don't need to focus on that, but it's just showing you that how there's a progression of skills. So by the time you get to grade, say 3 and 4, and then going into 5, it talks about using this literal and inferred meaning to evaluate and to build up content knowledge and integrate and analyze and evaluate texts. Look, we've got evaluation here. So probe actually helps me to find out if children can evaluate text. Probe actually helps me to find out if they can infer. Probe helps me to find out if they can use all of these skills to reorganize. So reorganization means that they use different skills in the text, different clues in the text, and they piece them together to get an overall answer. So this content descriptor shows me that my assessment is valid. So if you are doing a writing assessment, you should be able to find some clues or some evidence in the Australian curriculum to support that that's a good quality assessment. I'm not going to talk too much about multimodal presentation because I think it's something that we can talk about more in the interactive collab, but you do just need to be mindful that it is a multimodal presentation and you're going to use at least 2 modes, because 2 modes is the pass level, and we certainly don't want anybody failing because they haven't used their 2 modes. So please ensure that you've got 2 modes. It could be text with visuals, with audio. You could use a mixture of lots. The credit section asks for 3 modes, and it continues to go up and up from there. So please, we would be heartbroken as ELAs to have to mark people low in this section, knowing that they had really good quality stuff and really good quality content. So don't miss out on getting the marks that you deserve because you haven't used your modes and haven't done what you needed to do in this section. Modes are easy. As long as you've got some sort of visual element or an audio element or a text element, or perhaps a combination of lots of those in lots of different ways, can make it really interesting. I just pulled out that somebody did a Padlet. You could do lots of different kinds of screencasts. Ask around. I mean, there's lots of tech savvy people out there. They might have some ideas for some different programs. Some people did prezzies and talked to it, or perhaps had little video links in there. Just remember, if you are linking to video, that if it's a video of you or something that's relevant to the actual assessment, we will watch it. But if it's just a YouTube video that you're sharing just for the sake of sharing because it adds to your presentation somehow, then we won't watch that whole video. We will talk more about presentation ideas in the interactive collab, but there's also going to be an A2 exemplar, and that will give you some ideas. I think lots of it is based around what students did last time to give you lots of ideas. Now, just remember with the exemplar that the exemplar has bits cut out because you still do need to go off and do your own research and own finding of information. So if you see that it's a little bit light on in places, it's because particular information has been removed. So remember, it's just an example of what you could do. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the interactive collab.